My name is Joe Wilson, and I want to thank Professor Sleeper. He's my mentor on this project, so thanks, Professor. And I'd like to thank the MiraCosta Honors Program for putting on the Omni Research Conference. Thank you, guys. So, the image of the pirate is deeply ingrained in the modern imagination. Informed by several centuries of popular fiction, they have a reputation that has reached mythical status. Their legend has survived and grown throughout the ages, and it beckons us to take a closer look at these people and the circumstances that drove them to abandon society and risk their lives. In general, these individuals were in search of one thing: freedom and the ability to determine their own fate. The time referred to as the Golden Age of piracy occurred during the early 18th century, and it only lasted for a short time, between 1713 and 1718. This was a direct result of the British government's use of privateering as a military policy and its abrupt termination after the War of Spanish Succession. The pirates of this time were an unlikely example of Enlightenment ideals, that all men be created equal. They practiced a form of popular sovereignty where decisions were put to a vote and individuals had rights clearly defined in an agreement that every crew member signed upon admission to the crew. An important distinction that we must make is between pirates and privateers. A privateer was licensed by their government to attack foreign ships during wartime. For over 10 years, the War of Spanish Succession had been fought between England, France, and Spain. Vast resources were poured into their navies. To bolster their power at sea, England issued contracts to private captains called letters of marque that gave them permission to attack Spanish and French ships in the name of England. In exchange for their naval power, England allowed these privateers to keep the ships and cargo they seized, minus any taxes levied by the government. Like 007 and his license to kill, they've been given a license to steal. Between 1713 and 1714, a series of treaties were signed. Known as the Peace of Utrecht, these treaties ended the War of Spanish Succession, and when it came to an end, all privateering contracts became null and void. This peace may have been good for the British government, but it was terrible for the mariners working as privateers. They had lost their most valuable form of employment, leaving them with the much less desirable opportunities of the Royal Navy or the Merchant Marines. This, however, would not stop many of these former privateers from continuing the lucrative practice that they had learned in service to the crown. Pirates did essentially the same work as privateers, except they had no allegiance to any king or government. They operated as what we might call free agents. But in the world of expanding empire and mercantile rule, these wild cards had become a liability that their former employers would soon decide to put an end to. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the war machines of the Royal Navy and Merchant Marines were constantly in need of able-bodied men. Life aboard one of these ships was oppressive and dangerous, and if one survived, there's no guarantee they'd be able to leave their port once they returned home with their meager pay. It was more likely that they would immediately be scooped up by a press gang and forced back into service aboard another ship. In contrast with the Royal Navy, the Merchant Marines, or any other institution of the era, pirate companies were democracies. Decades before the American and French revolutions, pirates were engaging in a true democracy based on the ideals of liberty and equality. At the start of a new voyage, or the election of a new captain, a set of articles was drawn up, and all members of the crew were expected to sign. These have become known as the Articles of Agreement. They specified the voting process, how loot was to be divvied up, each man receiving an equal share of the prizes. They provided compensation for injuries, some of them even providing a form of life insurance to be delivered to specified persons upon a sailor's death. They specified various rules aboard the ship and what the consequences were for breaking the rules. This usage of signed agreements and with specified rules and protections for the individual and the policy of universal suffrage further supports my thesis that pirates of this time functioned as democracies. It is a clear example of the social contract and how these companies were ahead of their time. Most pirate companies had articles of agreement, and though they may have differed slightly from ship to ship, their similarities reflect their practicality. Since safety was key and a bigger crew was a safer crew, pirates happily accepted anyone who could sail and was willing to join. And typically, the only people who were forced to join were skilled workers such as navigators, carpenters, and surgeons. According to the maritime historian Marcus Rediker, it's estimated that 98% of pirates at this time were former Royal Navy or had served as privateers. Most of them were white men from English-speaking nations. However, not all pirates were white, and it would have been commonplace for a considerable number of a pirate crew to be of African descent. This led to an even greater sense of alarm for the British government, since many pirates turned out to be former West Indian slaves who had escaped their plantations, or who had joined the crew when their merchant ships were attacked, much preferring the life of a pirate with its vast increase in earnings and ability to have a say in decisions of the crew. Apart from their threat to commerce, the ability of these pirate companies to destabilize the institution of slavery posed an existential threat to the burgeoning empire of the British, and this put a target on their backs. Piracy was the only crime for which the punishment of death could be given with no trial and with no fear of reprisal for the one carrying out the punishment. If we look at the way the English government and elites viewed them, we may gain a better understanding of the reason these former privateers might have chosen to forsake their nation and become pirates. In the laws of the day, pirates were defined as hostis humani generis, which means enemies of all humanity. They were viewed as the worst form of traitors, thought to have forsaken their own country, and therefore not deserving of the common humanity afforded to other criminals. They were compared to Satan, in a constant state of hostility toward all humanity, and as a consequence, toward God himself. The revulsion of their government towards these men is a telling factor in their portrayal throughout fiction as bloodthirsty, ultra-violent monsters. It began with the embellishments of Nathaniel Mist, the English journalist better known by his pen name Captain Charles Johnson, and his book, The General History of the Pirates. The reality is that pirates were no more violent or cruel than any military mariner of the time. Their deeds must be judged on a case-by-case basis. Consider the famous Blackbeard, Edward Thatch, for whom there is no evidence that he killed anyone until the day he was ambushed and killed. In a deed for his father's estate that he left to his stepmother and siblings, Thatch wrote that it was, "For the love and affection I have for and bear towards my brother and sister, Thomas Thatch and Rachel Thatch." This shows a completely different and more human side of a man who has been vilified and demonized for over 300 years, beginning with Mist's general history. Mist had been arrested several times and was facing heavy fines. And being under considerable royal pressure, he was pushed to describe Blackbeard and the other pirates as the villainous characters we see in the general history. It was a smear campaign put on by the crown, seeking to garner resistance to these rising folk heroes who were growing in popularity amongst the colonial common folk. We can see the position that the privateers were in should they choose to turn pirate, but consider the situation they were put in by their own government. They had a set of skills. They were mariners and fighters, and they were well trained. These men were employed under contract by the English government one day, and the next day they had lost their means of living. At the time, many of them were stranded in remote Caribbean ports that were destroyed in the war. They were looked at as one of the lowest classes of their society simply for being mariners, never mind pirates. And due to the massive expenditures during the war, the Royal Navy, their only other opportunity for employment, had been effectively demobilized. These men's homes had been destroyed, and they were cut off from the protection of their government. Many of them simply had no other option than to keep doing what they were doing. This set of circumstances adds weight to my thesis that the golden age of piracy occurred as a direct result of the policies and decisions of the British government. The best analogy that I could give would be that of the Vietnam veterans coming home to a society that has rejected them and a government that has forgotten them. They were the ones who had been forsaken. Given the knowledge of the situation that they were in and the alternatives they were facing, we might begin to understand the frustration and abandonment felt by these young men. They may have felt betrayed by their country, their purpose having been taken away from them. There must have been those who felt a sense of inner turmoil when faced with the decision to turn pirate, a hesitation in the knowledge that they would be abandoning the protection of their country, and a realization of the triviality with which they've been treated by those in power. These could well have been the thoughts of many of the young British mariners who decided to engage in piracy. Out of this feeling of betrayal rose a hatred and a hostility, where old ideas of duty to the crown and country and God are abandoned for a new paradigm, freedom. In March of 1717, Captain Samuel Bellamy captured a small merchant sloop and invited its captain to join his crew. But upon being turned down by the wealthy merchant, Bellamy became enraged. In the general history, Nathaniel Mist recorded the captured captain's account of Bellamy's words, which perfectly outline the feelings of the pirates toward British elites. Damn ye, you are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security, for the cowardly whelps have not the courage otherwise to defend what they get by their knavery. But damn ye altogether, damn them for a pack of crafty rascals, and you who serve them for a parcel of hen-hearted numbskulls. They vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Would you not better make one of us than sneak after the asses of these villains for employment? Captain Beer slowly replied to Bellamy that his conscience would not allow him to break through the laws of God and man. You are a devilish, conscientious rascal, damn ye. I am a free prince, and I have as much authority to make war on the whole world as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea and an army of 100,000 men in the field. And this my conscience tells me. There is no arguing with such sniveling puppies who allow superiors to kick them about the deck at pleasure, and who pin their faith on a pimp of a parson, a squab who neither practices nor believes what he tells the chuckle-headed fools he preaches to. In his rant, Bellamy passionately embodies the frustrations of the pirates toward their British overlords, but in so doing, he also outlines the very irony and hypocrisy that many modern Americans must confront when considering the founding of our nation. A fair amount of cognitive dissonance is produced when the phrase, all men are created equal, is followed by the knowledge that most early American citizens were not afforded the right to vote. This right was based on property ownership, and it's a right that many of us now take for granted, but in the early days of our republic, so few of us would have had. It's said that history is written by the winners, which may pose this question. If the American revolutionaries had not been victorious and England had written the history books, would modern minds view those revolutionaries with the same disdain as the failed pirates? And had the pirates succeeded in creating their republic, would their narrative be different? If we can look beneath the surface level retelling of our nation's history, we will see that while our founding fathers were indeed working from Enlightenment ideals, a proper education, and even good intent, the lowly pirates, with their universal suffrage, diversity, and equality, had a much purer form of democracy. And they came together to form a republic of their own. The ship became the state, and the crew its citizens, held fast by their common goal of freedom. Thomas Hobbes stated in his second treatise that without a common power to keep him in check, man was in a constant state of war, a war of all against all. And he describes this as the state of nature. When a pirate abandoned his country for the war of all against all, he could most definitely be described as an enemy of all humanity. And this is how the British elites viewed these pirates, as enemies in a desperate state of nature, at war with all. But within a pirate crew, it was not a state of nature. There was a self-contained authority structure created by an agreement to form a company, and therefore the crew raised themselves out of the state of nature to form their own miniature state, as legitimate as any other state. The economic, political, and natural events of the short span of years from 1713 to 1718 precipitated a perfect storm that made this golden age of piracy possible. Abandoned by their government, these people came together to form a state of their own, creating a social contract and exercising popular sovereignty to protect the individual and the crew. It's inspiring to see the human ability to rise above circumstance, especially in an era where there was so much destitute suffering. It would be easy to overlook this and focus on the popular ideas of pirates as bloodthirsty monsters. But these ideas seem to be mere holdovers from the concept of hostis humani generis, a label created by elites, who by their very nature and actions fit that description better than those they gave it to. These Golden Age pirates caused a great disruption to the workings of the most powerful empire in the world. But beyond the material value of the ships and the goods they took, these people demonstrated the power of the human will and the ability to adapt to any circumstance, and above all, the ability to come together to achieve a common goal, something greater than any one of them could have done on their own. Thank you.
All right, now we'll move into a 5-minute Q&A session.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say your visuals were fantastic. I love the illustrations. They're just gorgeous. The colors and everything so vibrant. I really enjoyed that. I've enjoyed your entire presentation, but yeah, it was really beautiful.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because most of the art that I used is by one artist. His name's Howard Pyle. He lived from the mid 18th century through to the mid 19th century. And I remember the first time I read Treasure Island when I was a little kid. Not the cover of the book, maybe with the cover, but one of the first illustrations was by Howard Pyle, and I always thought how cool that was. And then in researching this project, I came to find that he was the artist behind most of the artwork that's used to like portray pirates that we see. Yeah, so Howard Pyle, really cool.
Do pirates, like, were they constantly on the water, or was it like they would plunder and then go back to the coast and then sell it and then and then go back, or?
So I'm really glad you asked that question because this is one thing I didn't have like time to put into my presentation. So no, they weren't always on the water. And in fact, there was a port. It still exists today, Nassau, and it's in the Bahamas. And it was one of those ports that was sort of forgotten by the British Empire, and it was ruined from a war during the Spanish Succession. So an ex-privateer, in fact, he had got a little group together. His name was Hornigold. I'm forgetting, I think James Hornigold. And him and Edward Thatch, Blackbeard, before he was Blackbeard, was part of his little group. They sailed from Port Royal, and they got these 3 canoes with sails on them, and they posted up at Nassau, and they started going out and raiding ships. But they brought everything back to Nassau, and because there was no British government in Nassau, smugglers could go there too, and so they had no shortage of sort of fences to fence their stolen goods. But they also went into the eastern seaboard too. At the end of his life, Blackbeard ended up the king put out a pardon to try and stop all these pirates from becoming pirates. He said, I'll give you a chance and I'll pardon you. So Blackbeard goes to the governor of South Carolina, and who had already been helping him fence his goods. He takes the pardon, he buys a house, and he gets his inner circle to buy houses and set up their shop there. And they were just gonna be pardoned and like living good lives on the surface, but then continue pirating. And he ended up getting ambushed and killed though. So.
That was really informative. I learned a lot, opened my eyes about pirates, basically. When you came across some of those facts, which you liberally put in there, like 98% of these folks were formerly with the Royal Navy, did that surprise you? From your knowledge base about pirates before, how much did you learn that completely changed your perception?
Actually, before I started the research on this, my mindset was in that pirates were bloodthirsty monsters. And it's funny because like the reason I titled this that was I loved pirates as a kid. I went to Pirates of the Caribbean in Disneyland, and I remember like 4 or 5 years old, I asked my dad, because I also love Spider-Man, but I could tell that the pirates were not the same type of heroes as Spider-Man was. And so I asked my dad, I was like, hey Dad, are there any good pirates? And he looks me dead in the eye and he goes, the only good pirate is a dead pirate. And so I was like, okay, well I'm still gonna be on the lookout for some redeeming qualities in pirates. No, but before I started the research, I thought that pirates were just killers, And it's important to note that I'm focusing on a very short span and a particular demographic, but piracy's been occurring for as long as mariners have been sailing the ocean. And there are different groups of pirates that were, from my research, far more violent than these pirates were. But I was surprised to find that these pirates, I guess I wasn't surprised to find that they were mostly British, because the first thing I learned about was privateers. I knew a little bit about privateers, so it made sense that they would transition pretty easily to becoming pirates, and because they worked for the British government, it made sense that they'd be British. But I was definitely surprised to find out how, and I think the point that I came away with is that they weren't out to be crazy, violent people. They were out to make money, and the better situation for them was to scare their opponents out of fighting back. And that's why they used things like the black flag and the death's head. They wanted to inspire fear so that there would be no resistance. And most of the time, they would take the cargo and they would give the ship back to the people and give them food to get back to wherever they needed to go to. If they wanted the ship, they'd take the ship, but they would give them another ship. Because they didn't want to take a bunch of prisoners unless they wanted to join the crew. It was a very practical thing. So yeah, I was surprised to find that there was, just to see the humanity in it,
Yeah. Thank you. Good presentation.
How much more do you think like a pirate's image can be rehabilitated? For instance, like as we go on in history, so many different groups and individuals almost have their history rewritten, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, do you think them as entrepreneurs and Republicans of, small R Republicans, like, is as far as they can go, like working men who get wet? Or do you think that essentially there will always be this myth and kind of concern because they used violence oftentimes as a means to get things done?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question, and I think one of the things that I read in my research, and I think it was Matthew Tyndall, one of the Enlightenment philosophers, and he was talking about, he said that, and one of his things, he said an enemy, to be viewed as a just enemy, like has to be, their purpose needs to be viewed as just. But he said if that's the case, then everyone would treat each other as unjust because no one thinks the other person is right.
Okay.
And so I think, and he also went further to say that the power of a state to be viewed as just kind of lies in their power to back up what they're saying with force.
Yeah.
So that was from an article that was sort of doing what I was doing, which is comparing the idea of the social contract to these pirates. So I think that if the pirates would have made it further and had more sort of backing up what they were doing, it would have been inevitable that it would force the other states around them to begin viewing them as legitimate. But I think that they were put down before they got to that place. But there was other pirate republics and groups of pirates throughout history that surpassed that line. And I think I may be totally misquoting here, but there was a story that I read about a Captain Barbarossa who was out of North Africa, and he amassed an army of pirates that became so powerful that the Ottoman Empire actually, granted them sovereignty, but they accepted that this is a functional state and we need to deal with them, with commerce.
Yep.
And we need to treat them as another state. So it has happened in history that a small group of pirates has grown enough to be viewed as legitimate by other states around them. And I think that it could happen, and you kind of have to look at the formation of any state. It's small beginnings and it grows, and they win battles and they win wars and they become bigger and they have a population. But it started off as a band of fighters, or just a small beginning, and eventually gets to a point where they have to be taken seriously by those around them. So I think that, and then just another thing that your question made me think of is that for me is the takeaway. For example, today, I think that the pirates today, I don't know what you guys think, but it seems to me that they're portrayed as just simply criminals. And yes, they may be committing crimes, but if we look at these pirates and we see what their backstory is and why they were doing what they were doing, and then ask those same questions to any group of pirates like the ones today, we could see, okay, there's a reason why they're doing what they're doing, and we may not like it, we may not agree with it, but it's just as valid as anyone else who is going out and, you know, taking action and making a decision. So, yeah, I think it's important to look at why pirates are doing what they're doing. So, yeah.
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks.
When I think of pirates, I think of like the mythical narratives, like Walking the Plank,
Yeah.
or the what's it called?
The hook.
The Hook.
Yeah.
The Hook, and the Pegged Leg. How much of that draws from reality, and like how did they get this such a warped stereotype, and you know how it's been like portrayed in media and stories? How did that happen?
So from my understanding, it does start with, at least our modern view, those things that you said.
Mhm.
It starts with Nathaniel Mist, aka Charles Johnson, and his general history, because that became so popular. Like Robert Louis Stevenson used the stories from the general history to formulate a lot of his characters in Treasure Island. So, and when you read the general history, there is a lot of truth to when things took place and sort of what happened, but there's a lot of embellishments, and Blackbeard in particular, if you read that, there's some just god-awful stuff that he's described as doing, and there's no evidence that he ever did that stuff. So then Robert Louis Stevenson takes that, and that becomes the smash that it was, and it just starts this, I think, sort of a snowball. Regarding the peg leg, though, that's one thing that was very real.
Wow.
But the thing is that if you were, for instance, in a pirate crew, if you were injured, a lot of the articles of agreement would say you signed, before you were injured, you signed, you were like, if you lose a leg, you get this much gold, or this many British pounds, whatever it was. And it would stipulate different limbs, how much you would get for that. It also stipulated that you were allowed to stay with the crew, even though you might not be able to participate in, you know, the stealing or the actual attacking. You could stay on board as long as you wanted. And most, not just pirates, but mariners that were injured, especially like that caused them to not be able to participate, they would end up actually serving as cooks, the cooks. So that's why Long John Silver, the main character of Treasure Island, he's the cook of the ship. That's a very real representation. But yeah, no, I think a lot of that, the embellishment just began to snowball over time, and so now we have what we have. So. Thank you.